Valentine's Day, a time for love, roses, and candlelight dinners. But what if I told you that behind the romance, there are dark stories soaked in fear, betrayal, and blood? Tonight, we're not talking about chocolates and heart-shaped cards. We're diving into three true Valentine's Day horror stories that prove love can be deadly. From a motel hiding a terrifying secret, to a graveyard where roses never fade, to a date that vanished into the night. These stories will make you think twice before saying "be mine." Turn down the lights, and let's begin on Valentine's Day. Emily had spent weeks planning the perfect surprise for her boyfriend, Daniel. She wanted everything to feel magical, unforgettable, the kind of memory that would last forever. While her friends exchanged flowers and chocolates, she decided to do something more adventurous. She had discovered an old motel on the edge of town, a place that hadn't been in business for years but still stood intact, hidden behind rows of tall, withered trees. The building had a reputation, whispered about in school and around town, stories of strange disappearances, flickering lights, and voices carried through the night air. To most, it was just another abandoned property, but to Emily, it seemed like the perfect backdrop for a thrilling Valentine's surprise, something that would leave Daniel both amused and amazed. When she told Daniel they were going for a late night drive, he didn't ask questions. He trusted her sense of adventure, and truthfully, he loved how her plans always carried a spark of unpredictability. As they drove further from the city lights, the road became narrower, and the shadows of trees stretched across the cracked pavement. The February air was sharp and cold, and the silence between the woods gave off a strange tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Daniel laughed nervously when the outline of the motel appeared, its neon sign broken, only one letter faintly glowing red against the night sky. Emily grinned as she pulled the car to a stop. She told Daniel she had decorated one of the rooms earlier that day with candles and rose petals, turning the creepy place into their own private hideaway. His hesitation was obvious, but curiosity and love pushed him to follow her. They walked through the entrance, the lobby's wallpaper peeling like old skin, the smell of mildew and dust heavy in the air. Every step echoed through the empty halls, but Emily's excitement drowned out the unease creeping into Daniel's chest. She held his hand tightly, leading him upstairs, whispering promises that the surprise would be worth it. At the end of the hall, room 14 waited with its door slightly ajar. Inside, Emily had done exactly as she promised. Candles flickered on the dresser, their flames casting soft glows across the cracked walls. Red rose petals trailed across the bedspread, forming a perfect heart shape at the center. Daniel's nervous laughter turned into a smile, and for a moment, the place seemed less eerie, more intimate, as though love could soften even the darkest corners. Emily beamed with pride, wrapping her arms around him, whispering that this night was theirs and theirs alone. Yet, even as they settled into the room, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The candle flames quivered though no breeze touched them, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the silence. He glanced at the cracked mirror across from the bed and thought he saw something move, just a shadow shifting behind them, though no one else was there. The air inside the motel grew colder as the night pressed on, and Daniel found himself listening more to the silence than to Emily's laughter. The building seemed alive with small, unsettling sounds, the groan of old wood under their weight, the faint scratching from the walls, and an occasional thump from somewhere above. Emily brushed it off, insisting it was just the motel settling, but Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing unease growing in his chest. He had expected the surprise to end with them laughing about how creepy the place was, but the reality was much heavier. The atmosphere felt wrong, as though the walls were holding secrets that wanted to spill out. After a while, Emily suggested they explore a little, just for fun, to add to the thrill of the night. She grabbed a small flashlight from her bag, leading Daniel back into the hallway. The corridor stretched ahead in a straight line, each room door identical except for the faded numbers. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if amplified, bouncing back toward them. Daniel noticed something peculiar. The deeper they went, the stronger the air smelled of damp rot and old metal, like rust mixed with something far more pungent. Emily seemed unfazed, but Daniel's eyes kept darting to the shadows pooling in the corners, half expecting them to move. They passed door after door until Emily stopped at one near the end, a room with its number plate missing. The door hung slightly crooked, and long claw-like marks scarred the wood near the handle, as though someone had tried desperately to get out. Emily's curiosity outweighed her fear, and she nudged the door open. The flashlight beam cut across a dusty, untouched room, but the longer they stood at the threshold, the more the air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. Daniel's pulse quickened as he thought he heard a faint whisper, coming from inside, soft but deliberate, almost like someone calling his name. Emily stepped inside with an eager smile, but Daniel froze, rooted to the doorway, his ears straining to catch the sound again. The flashlight flickered as they moved farther into the room. The walls were stained darker here, with patches that looked suspiciously like dried handprints. Furniture lay overturned in the corners, and the cracked ceiling sagged as though something heavy had once dragged across it. Emily was fascinated, kneeling down to pick up what looked like an old, water-damaged Valentine's card lying near the bed frame. The card had no name, only a message written in smeared ink: "Be mine forever." She laughed nervously, thinking it had been left as a prank, but Daniel couldn't take his eyes off the bed. The sheets, though covered in dust, bore the outline of someone who had lain there far too long. A sudden sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate knock that echoed from down the hallway. One knock, then two, then three, each one louder, resonating through the walls like a heartbeat. Emily's face paled as the flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. Daniel grabbed her hand, ready to pull her back to the safety of their decorated room, but before they could move, the sound shifted. This time, the knock came from the other side of the very door they had just entered through. Daniel's grip on Emily's hand tightened as the knocks grew slower, heavier, as though someone was deliberately toying with them. The sound reverberated through the rotting walls, and each impact sent a chill crawling up his spine. Emily tried to laugh it off, though her voice trembled when she whispered that maybe it was just the wind banging the door. But there was no wind that strong, no draft in this stagnant place that could mimic the sound of knuckles striking wood. The flashlight's weak beam shook in Emily's hands as she raised it toward the door, the light catching on the scratches that scarred its surface. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking, thick and suffocating, leaving them both listening too intently to the oppressive quiet. Daniel suggested they leave the room, maybe even leave the motel entirely, but Emily was stubborn, not wanting her carefully planned Valentine's surprise to dissolve into fear. She convinced him to return to the room she had decorated, promising they could lock the door and try to laugh about it later. Reluctantly, he agreed, though every step back through the hallway felt like a march deeper into something unseen. The walls seemed to narrow around them, the faded wallpaper curling like peeling skin, the floor creaking under their weight as if warning them not to continue. Their shadows stretched unnaturally long beneath the dim flashlight, bending at angles that didn't seem to match their movements. When they finally reached room 14, Daniel shut the door firmly behind them and slid the old bolt lock into place. The candle flames inside wavered violently, as though disturbed by a sudden gust of air. Though the windows were closed tight, Emily tried to lighten the mood, leading him back toward the bed with the rose-petal heart still intact, but the atmosphere had shifted. What once seemed romantic now looked grotesque. The petals too dark in the flickering light, almost resembling splashes of blood scattered across the blanket. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair, while Emily attempted to reassure him with forced smiles. Then, without warning, the mirror across from the bed shuddered. It was a small movement, subtle enough that Emily thought at first it was her imagination, but Daniel had seen it too. His breath caught in his throat as he leaned forward, staring at the fractured glass. The reflection of the room appeared distorted, darker than reality, as if the mirror had captured a version of the space that didn't belong to them. Behind their reflections in the dim glow was the faint outline of another figure standing near the dresser, tall and still, with no face, only the shadow of a head tilted slightly to the side. Emily gasped and whipped her head around, the dresser standing empty. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure had moved closer in the reflection, just behind Daniel's shoulder, though nothing was there in the room itself. The candles sputtered violently, their flames shrinking as if being smothered, and the air grew heavy, pressing down on their chests. Daniel stood abruptly, his pulse racing. But the reflection lingered a moment longer, before dissolving into the warped glass. As though it had never been there at all, the room felt heavier after the figure in the mirror vanished, as though something unseen had crossed over into their space. Daniel paced back and forth, his nerves fraying with every creak of the wooden floor beneath him. Emily tried to calm him, insisting that they were only scaring themselves, that the motel's age and decay were playing tricks on their minds. But her words lacked conviction now, and her eyes betrayed the fear she was desperately trying to hide. The roses on the bed seemed to have wilted in the short time they were gone, the petals curling in on themselves, their crimson edges darkened to the shade of dried blood. Daniel decided they couldn't stay in the room any longer. He grabbed Emily's arm gently but firmly, urging her toward the door. As he reached for the lock, the metal bolt resisted him. It felt jammed, stuck in place, even though it had slid easily before. He pulled harder, but the lock refused to budge, as if an invisible hand held it fast. Emily stepped back, her eyes wide as the temperature in the room dropped sharply, her breath now visible in small white clouds. The candles that had once flickered playfully now dimmed almost to nothing, and shadows spread across the walls in shapes that didn't match either of their movements. Then came the whisper, low at first, carried on the stale air, curling around their ears in words that weren't quite clear. Daniel froze, listening, trying to distinguish the sound. Emily clutched his hand tightly as the whisper grew louder, sharper, until it resolved into a chilling phrase, repeated over and over in a voice that was not male or female, but somewhere in between. Be mine forever, be mine forever. Each repetition pressed against their nerves like a knife scraping bone, the words vibrating through the walls as though the building itself was speaking. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the mirror. This time, there was no figure, only a black tar, like smear spreading across the glass, pulsating slowly as if alive. Emily whimpered, backing toward the bed, her legs trembling. She tried to convince herself it wasn't real, that none of it was real, but the air grew heavier still, pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. The smell of rust returned, stronger than before, but now it carried a sour metallic tang, unmistakably similar to the scent of blood. The knocking returned, louder, more violent, pounding against the door as if someone, or something, was desperate to get in. Each strike rattled the entire frame, dust raining from the ceiling, the floor vibrating beneath their feet. Daniel pulled Emily close, shielding her with his body, but the sound only grew angrier, each knock like a fist trying to break the wood apart. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pounding stopped. The silence afterward was suffocating, more terrifying than the noise, as though the motel itself was waiting for them to make their next move. And then, slowly, the lock they had struggled with began to turn on its own. The sound of the lock sliding free on its own filled the room, like a scream muffled under layers of wood and metal. Daniel staggered back, pulling Emily with him, both of them staring as the door creaked open inch by inch. The hallway outside was pitch black now, the faint light from the broken neon sign no longer reaching through the stained window. The darkness seemed unnatural, thick and almost fluid, as if it could swallow anything that stepped into it. Emily gripped Daniel's arm, begging him not to go near it, but the pull of that silent opening door was undeniable, like a lure beckoning them closer. Daniel raised the flashlight, its trembling beam cutting through the void beyond the doorway. For a moment, it revealed nothing but the peeling wallpaper and the uneven floorboards of the corridor. Then the light flickered, sputtered, and for the briefest second, a shadowy figure could be seen at the far end of the hall. It was tall, impossibly thin, its head tilted at the same unnatural angle they had seen in the mirror. The figure didn't move, but its presence was so heavy that both of them felt pinned to the spot, as if their own bodies no longer belonged to them. Emily whispered that they needed to run, but her voice was so quiet, as though speaking too loudly might draw the thing closer. Daniel nodded, his grip tightening around her hand, and they edged toward the door, trying to slip past the threshold without making a sound. The floor betrayed them. A single board cracked loudly beneath Emily's weight, the sound slicing through the silence like a gunshot. The shadow at the end of the hallway shifted. It didn't step, it didn't walk, it simply stretched, lengthening unnaturally, its shape extending down the hall toward them, as if the darkness itself was flowing into their space. Panic surged through them. Daniel yanked Emily into the hallway, dragging her in the opposite direction, their footsteps pounding as they ran past door after door. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, catching glimpses of rooms that seemed wrong, a bed with restraints, a wall covered in symbols scrawled in something dark, a chair facing a corner where something hunched just out of sight. The air grew thicker with each step, every breath scraping their lungs. Behind them, the sound of movement followed, not footsteps, but the scraping of something heavy being dragged across the floor, steady and relentless. Emily stumbled, but Daniel pulled her back up, urging her forward. They could see the end of the hallway now, the faint outline of the lobby doors beyond, But the closer they got, the farther away it seemed, like the building was stretching itself to keep them inside. The dragging sound grew louder, almost on top of them now, accompanied by the whispering voice once more, repeating its command with venomous sweetness, "Be mine forever." The words slipped into their heads, not just echoing in their ears, but rooting themselves deep inside, making it harder to resist the urge to stop running and turn around to face whatever wanted them. Their desperate sprint through the hallway felt endless, each step dragging them deeper into a nightmare that refused to let go. The flashlight flickered wildly, its beam shrinking until it barely illuminated a few feet ahead. Daniel could feel Emily trembling against his grip, her breath short and ragged, as though every inhale cost her more strength than she had left to give. The whispers followed them no matter how far they ran, curling around their ears, slipping beneath their skin, repeating the same chilling promise over and over. "Be mine forever." The words became so loud that they seemed to drown out even the pounding of their own footsteps. At last, they stumbled into what looked like the lobby of the motel. The once grand chandelier now hung crooked, most of its crystals shattered and scattered across the floor like broken teeth. The wallpaper peeled from the walls in great strips, exposing rotted wood beneath. Emily clutched Daniel's arm tightly, pointing toward the exit doors at the far end. Their panes of glass were so caked with grime that almost no light came through, but the faint outline of the night beyond was visible. That small glimpse of freedom was enough to push them forward. Just as they began to cross the lobby, the air shifted. The atmosphere thickened as though every ounce of oxygen had been sucked away. The whispers stopped abruptly, and in their absence came a sound far worse. A slow, deliberate creak of footsteps descending the staircase. Both of them froze, head snapping upward. At the top of the stairs, half shrouded in shadow, stood the figure. Its body seemed even taller now, its limbs unnaturally elongated, joints bending at wrong angles. Its head was still tilted, but now its faceless presence leaned toward them with an air of grotesque hunger. Daniel's first instinct was to run, to bolt toward the doors and drag Emily with him. But as he took a step, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Emily screamed, pulling him back as the figure began to descend the stairs. Each movement was agonizingly slow, but the sound of its limbs scraping against the railing filled the room, like nails dragged across a chalkboard. Daniel shined the flashlight directly at it, but instead of pushing the darkness away, the light seemed to bend around the figure, as though it refused to be seen fully. Emily clutched Daniel's hand so hard her nails dug into his skin, but neither of them dared to let go. They backed toward the corner of the lobby, trying to find another way out. The walls themselves seemed to shift, the doors they had seen seconds ago now gone, replaced by cracked wallpaper and splintering wood. The chandelier above rattled violently, swinging as if invisible hands were shaking it. Their hearts pounded, adrenaline surging, every instinct screaming that something was coming closer even as the figure at the stairs paused, tilting its head further, as if studying them. Then the whispers returned, softer this time, seeping from the walls and the floor, overlapping into a chorus. "Be mine forever. Be mine forever." The voices grew layered, dozens of them, hundreds, until the lobby echoed like a hive of the damned. Emily clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound was inside her head, filling her skull, crushing her thoughts. Daniel tried to pull her toward the staircase, thinking perhaps they could escape through the upper floor, but the moment his foot hit the first step, the figure vanished from sight. The whispers stopped, leaving behind a silence so heavy it pressed down like a weight, and both of them knew without saying a word that the entity hadn't left. It was now closer than ever. The silence after the whispers died was unbearable, thick enough that Emily could hear her own pulse thrumming in her ears. She clutched Daniel's arm as they both turned slowly, scanning the lobby with darting eyes, waiting for the figure to reappear. The flashlight's weak beam trembled over the walls, catching splinters of broken glass and the dark stains that painted the floorboards. Each second stretched into eternity, and the absence of sound was worse than the whispers had been. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then a low groan reverberated through the floorboards beneath their feet, as though the structure of the motel was alive and restless. The chandelier above swayed more violently, the chain straining until one snapped, sending crystals shattering across the lobby in a rain of sharp fragments. Emily screamed and ducked, pulling Daniel down with her. The crash echoed so loudly it seemed to shake the entire building, but the true horror was not the noise, it was what they saw when they looked up again. The figure had returned, but now it was no longer confined to the staircase. It stood at the center of the lobby, its body impossibly close though they hadn't seen it move. The shadows around it swirled like smoke, clinging to its limbs, stretching outward as if reaching for them. The air grew colder still, so cold that Emily's lips turned pale, her breath coming in visible bursts. Daniel shoved the flashlight toward the figure, but once again the light bent away, warping as if the very darkness rejected illumination. The whispers started again, though quieter this time, almost tender, as though coaxing rather than commanding. "Be mine forever." The words slid into Daniel's mind with terrifying intimacy, echoing not just in his ears but in the deepest parts of his thoughts. He felt the urge to stop resisting, to surrender to whatever this thing was, if only it meant the fear would end. His grip on Emily's hand loosened for a moment, and she noticed. With panicked eyes, she begged him to stay with her, shaking him, her voice breaking as she whispered his name again and again. That plea seemed to snap him back, and he tightened his hold, pulling her close as though anchoring himself to her. The figure tilted its head further, an unnatural crack echoing from its neck as it bent at an impossible angle. The sound made Emily gag, her stomach churning. The shadows reached farther now, stretching across the floor toward their feet. Daniel grabbed a chair and hurled it toward the entity, the wood splintering uselessly on impact. The figure did not flinch, but the shadows recoiled slightly, as though annoyed. Seizing the moment, Daniel pulled Emily toward the far side of the lobby, searching desperately for another exit. His eyes caught the outline of a service hallway, its door half open, leading into darkness. It was their only chance. They sprinted across the floor, glass crunching beneath their shoes, the whispers chasing after them in a growing frenzy. "Be mine forever. Be mine forever." Just as they reached the hallway door, Emily swore she felt a hand brush against her shoulder, cold and heavy, but when she turned her head, nothing was there except the suffocating dark curling in around them. The service hallway swallowed them as soon as they stepped inside, its air heavier than the lobby's, thick with the stench of mildew and rot. The narrow corridor stretched ahead like a throat, its walls damp and blistered with mold, pipes hissing faintly above their heads as if the building itself were breathing. Daniel's flashlight flickered, struggling against the oppressive darkness, its cone of light barely pushing past a few feet. Emily clung to his arm, her voice trembling as she whispered that they should turn back, but Daniel pressed forward, convinced this hallway had to lead to an exit. The floorboards creaked under every step, each groan echoing unnaturally down the corridor, until it seemed like someone was walking directly behind them. Daniel swung the light back quickly, his heart hammering, but nothing was there, only the same peeling wallpaper and long stretch of shadow. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, and she swore she saw something move at the corner of her vision, a shape that slithered just out of the beam. When Daniel turned the light again, the space was empty, but the feeling of being watched never left them. As they moved deeper, the whispers returned, softer this time, distant, as though seeping from the very walls of the corridor. The words were indistinct at first, a hiss like wind slipping through cracks, but gradually they shaped into that same phrase, repeated over and over, "Be mine forever." Emily pressed her hands against her ears, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't just around them. It was inside them, threading through their thoughts, tugging at their resolve. She began to slow, her steps faltering as though the voice had her under a spell. Daniel noticed and yanked her forward, his own resolve shaking but his grip firm, desperate not to let her slip away. They passed a series of doors along the hallway, each warped and rotted, hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Some stood slightly ajar, and as the flashlight swept past, Daniel caught glimpses of what lay inside a room filled with dozens of wilted bouquets, their petals blackened, another containing rows of broken heart-shaped boxes, each leaking a dark, sticky fluid, a third where dozens of Valentine's cards were pinned to the wall, every one smeared with something that looked like dried blood. Emily begged him not to look, urging him to keep going, but he couldn't stop his eyes from catching those details, each more disturbing than the last. Then came the sound that froze them both in place, a slow dragging, like nails clawing along wood, echoing from somewhere ahead. Daniel held the flashlight steady, his hand shaking uncontrollably as the beam trembled over the hallway's far end. The dragging grew louder, closer, accompanied by a rhythm like breathing, deep, labored, animalistic. Emily clutched his arm so tightly that her nails broke skin, but she didn't even notice. The hallway seemed to stretch further the faster they tried to move, the exit door at the far end always shrinking away no matter how many steps they took. The air thickened until every breath was agony, and the walls seemed to pulse as though alive, their shadows twitching in time with the whispers. The dragging was almost upon them now, echoing so close it seemed to scrape directly behind their heels, and with every second, the voice grew louder, more insistent, promising them they could never leave. Daniel's lungs burned as he dragged Emily along the endless hallway, the flashlight stuttering like a dying star in his hand. The dragging sound was so close now that it felt as though something was reaching out, ready to hook its claws into their backs. The whispers swelled, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every crack in the walls, each one carrying the same haunting message: be mine forever. Emily's sobs broke between gasps, her feet stumbling over the uneven floor, but Daniel refused to stop, terrified that if they slowed even for a second the thing would consume them. The end of the hallway finally seemed within reach, a warped metal door barely visible through the shadows. Hope surged inside Daniel, fragile but enough to push him faster. Emily, shaking, tried to keep her eyes forward, but something caught her attention from the corner of her vision. One of the warped doors along the hall creaked open by itself, revealing a sliver of flickering light within. Against her will, her head turned. Inside, dozens of figures sat slumped at broken tables, their bodies withered and gray as if long dead. Each one wore some token of Valentine's Day: wilted corsages, crumbling roses, tattered dresses stained with age. Slowly, their heads began to lift in unison, empty sockets glowing faintly red, and Emily screamed, jerking her gaze back to the corridor. Daniel tightened his grip and pulled harder, not daring to look. The dragging behind them turned into pounding, as though whatever hunted them had quickened its pace. The walls groaned, wallpaper peeling and curling, releasing the stench of damp rot and iron. The light above sputtered violently, plunging them into blackness for seconds at a time, each flicker revealing the hallway unnaturally closer or longer, like reality itself was twisting. The metal door loomed nearer, and Daniel shoved Emily toward it. His hands rattled against the cold handle, slick with condensation, and he yanked desperately. It didn't move. He cursed under his breath, pulling harder, his panic mounting with each second. Emily pressed herself against him, her tears streaking down her cheeks as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening chant, every voice demanding their surrender. Be mine forever. Be mine forever. Daniel slammed his shoulder against the door again and again, pain shooting through his bones, until finally the rusted frame groaned. A crack split open, letting in a thin draft of night air that cut against the suffocating staleness of the corridor. He pushed with everything he had, forcing the gap wider, urging Emily through even as she cried out that the shadows were reaching for her ankles. Her screams tore at him, but he pulled harder, dragging her with him. Behind them, the sound changed. No longer dragging, no longer pounding. The figure was simply there, impossibly close, its presence pressing down like a storm. The temperature plummeted, frost creeping across the walls, sealing cracks with ice. Daniel could feel it looming over his shoulder, something cold brushing the back of his neck. Emily clutched his shirt, screaming his name, as the voices thundered in unison. Filling the corridor like a tidal wave that threatened to crush them where they stood, Daniel heaved with every ounce of strength he had left, his body slamming into the rusted metal door one final time. With a screech like tearing steel, the hinges gave way and the door burst open, spilling them into the icy night. The cold air struck their lungs like knives, but it was air that was real, free of the suffocating rot and whispers of the motel. Emily collapsed onto the ground outside, gasping, clawing at the dirt as though to remind herself that it was solid. Daniel stumbled out after her, dragging the flickering flashlight which finally sputtered and died the moment they crossed the threshold. Behind them, the doorway gaped like a mouth. Darkness pooled at its edges, pulsing with unnatural rhythm, as though the building itself resented letting them escape. From within, the whispers screamed in unison, a final, furious chorus of "Be mine forever!" so loud that the earth beneath them seemed to quake. The shadowed figure stood framed in the doorway for an instant, its elongated body stretching outward, fingers twitching as though reaching into the night. For one terrible moment, Daniel thought it would follow. But as soon as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, spilling pale light across the motel, the figure froze. Its body shuddered violently, and then, with an ear-splitting shriek, the doorway slammed shut. The building groaned, sagging under its own weight, and then all at once it was silent. Emily buried her face into Daniel's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. He held her tightly, though his own tears burned at the corners of his eyes. They had survived the night, but neither of them felt like the same people who had entered that place. The romantic surprise that had begun their Valentine's weekend had been replaced with scars too deep to name. When they finally looked back, the motel was no longer looming with sinister life. It stood crumbling, broken, its windows black voids and its walls caked in rot, just an abandoned husk under the morning sun. Yet even as they stared, both of them could swear they still felt it watching, waiting patient. Hand in hand, they walked down the dirt road, leaving the motel to rot behind them. Each step away from it felt lighter, though the memory of the whispers lingered like a brand inside their minds. Neither spoke for a long time, afraid that to give words to what they had seen would invite it back into their lives. The wind carried the faint scent of roses, wilted and sour, and Emily squeezed Daniel's hand, silently begging him not to let go. He promised he wouldn't. When they finally reached the highway and flagged down a passing car, the driver asked them what had happened. Both opened their mouths to answer, but no words came. Some truths, they realized, were too heavy to tell. As the car drove them away, the motel faded into the horizon, but deep down they both knew it hadn't ended. It never truly ended. The promise still lingered, carved into their minds, a vow that could never be erased, be mine forever. Thank you so much for listening to this story until the very end. Your support means the world, and I truly appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to watch, listen, and share these terrifying tales. If you enjoyed this and want more chilling stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your encouragement keeps these stories alive, and I can't wait to share even more with you. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, you never know what might be waiting in the dark.